Welcome to another deep dive. Here, as always, we're going to be looking at some really dense, interesting information and pulling out the key takeaways for you guys.
Right.
Today, we're looking at aesthetics, and in particular, the work of RG Collingwood,
Yeah.
primarily using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy
Right.
as a jumping-off point.
Great.
So Collingwood, he was a major figure, really, in 20th century philosophy.
Yeah.
But not primarily for aesthetics.
No. He was known as a philosopher of history. He did some really important work in metaphysics. He was even an archaeologist.
You're right.
So all of these different things. And he actually considered his work on aesthetics kind of secondary.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it has had a really lasting influence.
Right.
And particularly his development of the expressive theory of art.
Okay.
So he's a really important figure there.
So we're talking post-World War II England
Yeah.
and Collingwood kind of coming into prominence there.
Yeah.
And his central thesis is that art is fundamentally expression. Right. It's almost like his work on history, trying to reenact mental states of individuals in the past, finds a parallel here in that he's
Yes.
almost trying to get at what is the mental state that is jointly realized by the artist and the audience.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's the central kind of irreducible idea that art is expression.
Right.
But he identified a couple of major obstacles to understanding this idea.
Okay.
One is the fact that we use the word art to mean all sorts of different things.
Mhm.
And he thought that was a big problem. We need more precision. And the second one was that he felt that we needed a philosophical theory of what expression actually is. So not just something that artists do,
Right.
but something that's kind of essential to how our minds work.
Okay.
So he was really insistent on that point.
So we're looking in particular at the Principles of Art, which was published in 1938.
Right.
And this is really Collingwood kind of coming into his own with his more mature ideas.
Right. Yeah. And superseding his earlier work.
Right. And so right out of the gate,
Hmm.
he wants to make a very clear distinction between what he calls art proper and four other more common uses of the word art that he actually considers to be misapplications.
Right.
And those four are art as craft, art as magic, art as representation, and art as amusement.
Right.
And he thinks these need to be very clearly distinguished.
Absolutely.
And I think this is where Collingwood might really differ from a lot of modern aestheticians
Yeah.
who maybe have kind of come to accept, like, if it's called art, it's art.
Yeah.
The institutional theory of art.
Right. Exactly. He would say that these theories, like the institutional theory or talk about mass art, popular culture, it all suffers from this initial confusion
Right.
about what art is. So
Right.
we need to get clear
Yeah.
on the essence of art
Right.
before we can even begin to talk about these other things.
Okay, so let's start with art as craft.
All right.
And he points out that this actually is a very long history. I mean, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
Right. These guys advocated for a craft theory of art.
Absolutely.
So according to Collingwood, what is it that defines craft?
Well, for Collingwood, craft isn't just being skilled at something. It's actually a specific logical structure.
Okay.
And it has these 6 characteristic features.
Okay.
So the easiest way to think about it is to imagine like a potter making a pot.
Okay.
So first of all, there's this distinction between the means and the ends.
Okay.
So shaping the clay is the means, the pot is the end.
Right.
Second, there's this distinction between planning and execution.
Okay.
So the potter envisions the pot that he's going to make,
Right.
and then he goes ahead and he makes it.
Right.
Third, there's the ends precede the means in planning,
Okay.
but the means precede the ends in execution.
Okay.
Right. So you have the pot in mind, and then you figure out how to make it.
Right.
But in the actual making of the pot, you start with the clay, and then you end up with the pot. Fourth, there's this distinction between the raw material and the finished product.
Okay.
So you've got the clay and you've got the pot.
Right.
Fifth, there's this distinction between form and matter.
Okay.
So the same lump of clay could have been a bowl,
Right.
could have been a plate. It doesn't have to be a pot.
Right.
And then sixth, crafts very often have these hierarchies.
Okay.
So, the clay comes from the earth. It has to be processed.
Right.
Then the potter gets it. He shucks it. And then, you could have different crafts producing tools for other crafts. So think about like a complex thing like making a computer. You've got all these different trades working together. So that's kind of the structure of craft for Collingwood. It's this very clear kind of, you plan what you're going to make.
Right.
Then you execute the plan.
Right.
You have the materials. And then you reach the predefined end.
Right.
Like following a recipe, basically.
Right.
Every step is a means to the end of the dish.
All right. So Collingwood's argument is that art proper can't essentially be craft because there are so many examples of things that we recognize as art that just don't fit within this kind of framework.
Right, exactly. So his big example here is, a melody that suddenly comes to a composer.
Right.
In that initial moment of inspiration, where is the plan distinct from the execution?
Right.
Where are the identifiable means being employed to reach some predetermined end? He would say if the composer had a blueprint in their mind, the melody would already be fully formed.
Right.
So there's something else going on there.
Okay. So how would he respond to the kind of obvious counter-argument that, okay, well, for a poem, the words are the raw material and the poem is the finished product?
Yeah.
I mean, he actually does get into this.
He does.
And he even brings up, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and says, okay, well, where's the raw material for this?
Right.
Was it all these things that Eliot read?
Right.
Was it just, stuff in his head? Like, how do we account for this?
Right. And his response is, it's a bit of a promissory note.
Okay.
Because he says, we need his full theory of expression to really account for this.
Okay.
But he does say that, the poet converting emotions into poems is different from a carpenter converting wood into a table.
Right.
He's not really elaborating yet, but he is saying it's not a simple transformation of a pre-existing material in the way that craft typically is.
Right.
And he also very briefly acknowledges that, one might consider language as the material in some sense, which makes things a little bit more complicated.
Right. Okay. So what about this distinction between form and matter?
Yeah.
It would seem like that, you could apply that to certainly some art forms like sculpture.
Yeah.
You're shaping some kind of physical substance.
Right.
How does he respond to that?
His point there is that in craft, the form-matter distinction relies on being able to identify the matter before you impose the form.
Okay.
So the same block of marble can become the David or, something totally different.
Right.
But in art, especially in its initial conception, so think about like a dance idea or the core feeling of a painting before you start painting.
Right.
It's very hard to isolate some pre-existing matter that's just taking on a form.
Right.
The initial artistic impulse is much more integrated than that.
Okay.
It's not like you've got some raw material that you then shape.
Right.
It's something more kind of holistic and unified.
So even if a work of art incorporates, let's say, elements of craft,
yeah.
Right? Like the actual, technical skill of a painter.
Right.
Applying the paint.
Yeah.
That doesn't make it essentially a craft.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So being a successful craftsperson.
Exactly.
In the execution of the thing doesn't make it art proper.
Exactly, right. And he was very much aware that this kind of craft theory of art had evolved in the modern period.
Right.
And he strongly critiqued this version of it, which is called art as a psychological stimulus.
Right.
So this is the view that art is basically a set of techniques for manipulating objects, like colors, sounds, words,
right,
in order to produce these predictable psychological states in the audience.
Right. Sad song makes you sad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Happy song makes you happy.
When vibrant colors make you feel joyful.
Right. Exactly.
And Collingwood just utterly rejects this.
Yeah.
Famously saying, the artist is not a purveyor of drugs.
Exactly. So reducing art to a mere tool for kind of manipulating emotions towards some predetermined end, he thinks, puts it firmly back in the realm of craft and completely misses the fundamental nature of genuine artistic expression.
Okay, let's move on to the next category that he wants to kind of dismantle.
Okay.
Which is art as representation. So the obvious one here that we all think of is, a portrait.
Yeah.
Right? That accurately depicts its sitter.
Exactly.
And so here, Collingwood concedes that, okay, representation in that very straightforward sense where you're really just trying to, have a perfect likeness.
Yeah.
Clearly, that involves some kind of skill and some kind of technique.
Right, right.
You have a specific goal.
Exactly.
Which is to create this recognizable image.
Right.
And you're employing your abilities to achieve it.
Right.
So in that sense, it fits within the structure of craft.
Right, exactly. You've got a goal.
Right.
You've got a set of means.
Right.
And you're using those means to achieve the goal.
Right.
That's craft.
Okay. But he argues that actually representation in art is more nuanced than just that simple visual accuracy.
Right.
So the text says he has this more liberal notion of representation.
Yeah.
What is that?
So for Collingwood, the success of representation isn't just how closely the artwork, visually resembles the original.
Right.
He actually says something can represent something even if the feeling it evokes in the viewer is similar to the feeling evoked by the original subject.
Okay.
So it's not just about, visual accuracy.
Right.
It's about capturing and conveying this kind of feeling.
Right.
That's similar to the original.
So basically he's broadening what representing something means.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not just a visual thing.
Uh-huh.
It's about, can you look at this painting and have the same kind of feeling that you would have if you were actually looking at the thing?
Okay.
And he actually outlines 3 degrees of representation.
Okay.
Starting with, what we would think of as the most obvious one, literal representation,
right,
like a photograph.
Right.
Or certain kinds of paintings.
Right. Oh. So what are the other 2 degrees?
Well, the second one is called modified representation.
Okay.
So here, the artist is intentionally leaving out elements that are actually present in what they're depicting, or, modifying things, exaggerating things, whatever.
Right.
And his example here is Van Gogh, who, might leave out details or exaggerate them, or, introduce elements that weren't literally there.
Right.
He even thinks that a painting could represent a dance.
Okay.
Without showing any actual dancers.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting.
Interesting.
And then the 3rd degree is what he calls emotional representation.
Okay.
So this is representing the kind of inner feeling,
right,
emotional essence of something.
Okay.
And he's got this kind of evocative example of music that might represent the feeling of lying in the deep grass on a summer's day watching the clouds drift by.
Okay. So now what's the really crucial distinction that Collingwood is making between this idea of emotional representation and his own idea of expression, which is what he considers to be art proper?
Yeah. Well, the key difference for Collingwood is the artist's prior knowledge.
Okay.
So in representation, even emotional representation, there's this assumption that the artist has a kind of preconceived idea of what they're aiming to depict or evoke.
Okay.
Right. So they set out to represent this feeling or this scene or whatever.
Okay.
But for Collingwood, the artist, when they're engaged in art proper, doesn't necessarily know the expressive content of the work before the act of creation itself. So the process of creating is the process of the emotion becoming clear to the artist.
Okay, so it's not like you're trying to represent some pre-existing feeling that you're aware of.
Right.
It's like through the art, you're actually coming to terms with and understanding whatever it is you're expressing.
Exactly. And the text also mentions another related distinction, which is that represented content tends to be general. Right? Like lots of different pictures can represent the same person.
Whereas expressed content is deeply individual.
Exactly.
And specific to, the artist's experience at that moment.
Yeah. So there's kind of a difference in scope there.
Okay. So let's move on to art as magic.
Okay.
So this one might seem a little bit out there.
Yeah.
What does magic have to do with art?
Right.
Collingwood actually argues that it's closer than we might initially think.
Right.
But he still classifies it as a kind of craft.
Exactly. Yeah.
So first of all, we need to understand how Collingwood understands magic.
Right.
He's not talking about, like bad science.
Yeah.
Or some kind of, Freudian neurosis.
Right.
Like people who believe they have, supernatural powers, that kind of thing.
No.
Right. He's arguing that magic is actually a kind of ritualized representation of an emotion that's considered to be useful.
Right.
Not for, emotional release. Not catharsis.
Right.
But for its practical value in achieving some kind of outcome.
Exactly.
So give us an example here.
Well, the classic example is like a war dance.
Okay.
Right. So you've got the rhythmic movements, the chanting, the wielding of weapons.
Right.
This is all aimed at, instilling courage in the warrior.
Right.
And intimidating their opponents.
Right.
So it has this very practical function.
Okay.
It's not just about, letting off steam.
Right.
It's about achieving a specific end.
Right. Okay. So even if there are these kind of false beliefs involved.
Yeah.
Like, a rain dancer really believes that they're making the rain come.
Yeah.
Right. Collingwood sees that as kind of a perversion of the underlying function.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So what does he consider the kind of true magical effect?
Yeah. So the true effect for Collingwood is the kind of reinforcement of hope and the encouragement of continued effort in the face of some kind of challenge.
Okay.
Right. So, a prolonged drought.
Okay.
He contrasts this with like a purely Freudian interpretation that might see this as just wish fulfillment.
Right.
Right. He's saying, no, there's something more to this.
Right.
Magic is actually playing a role in a kind of healthy society
by
fostering these positive psychological states and kind of social cohesion.
Right.
We all come together and we do the rain dance, and it makes us feel like, okay, we're doing something about this.
Right. We have some agency.
Exactly. Yeah. We're not just helpless.
Okay.
And then he goes on to point out how many aspects of our own seemingly rational society, things like religion, patriotism, sporting rituals, social customs, they still involve these kinds of ritualized actions with these kind of underlying magical purposes of reinforcing shared emotions and values.
Right. So he's saying it's not like magic is just something that primitive people do.
Right. Exactly.
It's like it's built into even these, modern societies that we think are so rational and scientific.
Yeah, exactly. We still have these needs to come together and kind of, reaffirm our shared values and beliefs.
Okay. And so this is where the potential confusion with art proper arises.
Right.
He brings up the example of religious art.
Yeah.
Like a, beautiful 12th century crucifix.
Right. Yeah.
And he says, okay, this can be aesthetically powerful.
Yeah.
Right. And, induce feelings of religious awe.
Right.
And, piety and whatever.
Yeah.
So where's the distinction there?
Well, his point is that the mistake is when we start evaluating art proper based on whether its subject matter has this kind of positive or salutary effect on the audience.
Right.
So, we praise a play because it, promotes progressive views on sexual politics or something like that.
Right.
He's saying that's judging it based on its magical function. Right. Its ability to instill a certain attitude or belief.
Right.
It's not judging it based on its intrinsic qualities as art proper.
Okay.
Right. So he's not saying that you can never have both.
Right.
There might be works of art that are both aesthetically powerful and have this kind of magical effect.
All right.
But he's saying we need to keep those things distinct in our minds.
Okay. So finally, we come to art as amusement.
Right.
And this one he defines as aiming to stimulate and then discharge emotion through make-believe means.
Right.
So how does this differ from magic in terms of the intended outcome?
Yeah. So the big difference is in the kind of duration and the purpose of the evoked emotion.
Okay.
So in magic, the goal is for the emotion to persist.
Right.
And, ideally lead to some kind of action or reinforcement of a belief.
Right.
So, if a work of art makes you feel very strongly about environmental conservation,
right,
the aim is that you remain concerned.
Right.
And maybe take steps to help. But amusement is about this temporary kind of emotional earthing.
Okay.
Or release.
Okay.
So the emotion is evoked for the sake of enjoyment.
Right.
And then it's kind of expected to dissipate.
Right.
It's not supposed to kind of linger.
Okay.
And it's interesting because Collingwood puts a lot of what we typically consider literature and drama in this category.
Right.
Yeah.
Even like Thackeray, he mentions.
Right.
And a lot of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Right.
He thinks most of Shakespeare is amusement.
Right.
Which is a bit of a, controversial claim.
Yeah.
But his point is that a lot of storytelling and dramatic performance is primarily aimed at entertaining the audience.
Right.
By simulating these emotions that are then discharged through the experience of watching or reading.
And again, he's careful to point out that amusement and art proper are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They can coexist within the same work.
Exactly.
But writing in 1938,
yeah,
Collingwood expresses some concern about the rise of what he calls decadent amusement.
Right. Yeah. He was worried about this.
And he brings up specifically pornography.
Yeah.
And works that cater to class fascination.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And he sees this as a potentially negative thing.
Right.
For society.
Right. And he even draws a parallel with Plato's famous argument for banishing the artists from the Republic.
Right.
He thinks Plato kind of saw this coming.
Right.
This kind of decline of, Greco-Roman civilization,
Right.
fueled in part by this kind of demand for decadent amusement.
Right. Yeah.
But his main point in the context of his theory is that amusement, while it involves a kind of skill and intention and therefore can be considered craft, is ultimately distinct from art proper.
Okay.
And he also critiques the tendency to use the criteria for successful amusement as standards for judging genuine art. So, things like, the elicitation of pleasure in, refined individuals.
Right.
That was Hume's view. He's saying, those are fine criteria for amusement.
Right.
But they're the wrong criteria for judging art.
Okay. So having meticulously and exhaustively cleared away these 4 common misunderstandings of art, Collingwood finally arrives at his own central concept, which is art as expression.
Okay.
So if it's not about stimulating preconceived emotions or simply representing them, what does he mean by this?
Oh, okay. So the crucial thing to keep in mind is that art proper for Collingwood is not a craft.
Okay.
Right. So all those neat distinctions we made between means and ends, planning and execution, they just don't apply here.
Okay.
Instead, he describes the process of expressing an emotion as the process of becoming consciously aware of a feeling that is at first kind of vague and undefined.
Okay.
So you might just feel this kind of general perturbation or excitement within yourself.
Right.
And you think, well, I feel something, but I don't know what I feel.
Right.
And the act of trying to express it, whether through language, music, painting, whatever, is actually how you come to understand the specific nature of that emotion.
Okay, so you're not expressing some pre-existing thing that you're aware of.
Right. Exactly.
Through the art, you're coming to terms with and understanding it.
Exactly, yeah. And there are 3 key insights that emerge from this.
Okay.
The first is that expression is fundamentally about achieving consciousness of an emotion.
Okay.
It's not about executing some pre-existing plan.
Right.
Second, expression individualizes the emotion.
Okay.
So instead of just using these kind of general labels to describe what you're feeling, I'm sad, I'm angry, the act of artistic expression, the specific poem, the particular arrangement of notes, the unique brush strokes, those embody the very specific and nuanced feeling itself.
Right.
So you're not just saying, I'm sad.
Right.
You're making sadness itself, perceptible.
Right.
And here he follows very closely the philosopher Croce, who also emphasized the importance of intuition and expression in art.
Okay.
And then the third point is that the feeling of kind of lightening or relief that often accompanies successful expression isn't simply catharsis. So it's not just venting the emotion without understanding it. It's actually about achieving this kind of clarity and focus on the emotion, which can actually sometimes intensify the feeling rather than diminish it. Host speaker.